In mid-1941, the Admiralty's Anti-Submarine Warfare Division quietly circulated a bulletin that few outside Whitehall ever saw. On it, 2 columns, 4 numbers each, the dates of 4 convoys that reported an unresolved acoustic loss in the Mid-Atlantic Gap. In the margin, pencil underlined in red, breaks in traffic at identical longitude. This was the Black Pit, the patch of ocean too far west for RAF Coastal Command to reach from Ireland, yet not far enough east for US Navy Hudsons in Newfoundland to cover reliably. Here, in a triangle of grey North Atlantic nothingness, between roughly 53 degrees and 18 degrees, ships could simply stop talking and be gone forever. In 1941, the British were losing hulls faster than they were replacing them, and a fraction of those losses were never even tied to a torpedo report. No flash sightings, no periscope splash trails, no oil slicks hours later, just silence for convoys HX, SC and on, the slugging matched traffic lanes between Halifax, Sydney, and Liverpool. The Gap was a place every escort officer dreaded because he could not fight the thing he could not see. U-boat wolfpacks certainly haunted the region, and ultra-cryptanalysts working on the naval Enigma keys knew that BDU, the German U-boat command, routinely tried to funnel boats there, using the ocean itself like a stage curtain. But even in this most logical place for submarines to thrive, the Admiralty's naval staff kept getting cases that did not fit the normal U-boat profile. A torpedo strike in 1941 was rarely clean and silent. There were almost always 2 detonations. First the magnetic or impact fuse, then the secondary structural failure of the hull. Those bangs travelled, escorts logged them. The gunnery officer on a destroyer would look up from his tea and write down the bearing on the wardroom bulkhead chalkboard. Yet several of the strangest vanishings left absolutely nothing for the escorts to note. One Royal Navy signalman, later recorded in IWM Sound Archive 1954-02-14, recalled, "The bearing just stopped scrolling. It was there. Then the plot was empty." That testimony has been repeated in modern sonar schools as a perfect description of a sudden loss of a return trace. But the important context is this. Wartime sonar, ASTAC, was not continuous scan radar in the air. It was a pulse echo. If a target disappeared, that meant either the hull was gone or the geometry of the water column changed so abruptly that the returning ping was swallowed in the thermocline. Either way, the escort officer was left with nothing to shoot at. Historically, this mattered because each loss was an intelligence loss as much as a tonnage loss. Convoy commodores kept voyage logs, fuel consumption records, and course sheets that told the Admiralty which routes were safe and which were suicidal. When a ship died in the Black Pit, all that data died too. And the Admiralty, pressed by Churchill's minute-by-minute cables, had to decide whether a route was fatal because of a U-boat, or because of something they literally did not yet understand. Declassified after the war, ADM 199 files are almost painful to read. Thin sheets typed on battered Remingtons, half of them marked "No wreckage sighted." One British escort commander, Lieutenant Commander J.P. Dalrymple Hamilton, scribbled in the margin of his report, "The ocean was clean. Our lookouts saw nothing. It is not melodrama. It is the closest thing we have to a field." Diary note describing the emotional absurdity of trying to fight an enemy that leaves no evidence that it has killed your merchantman. Modern oceanographers later mapped this region with GeoSat, satellite altimetry corrections, and found seamounts steep enough to break hulls that strike them at speed, yet those charts were not known in 1941. The wartime naval staff were fighting a multivariable problem with only 2 variables defined: Hitler's U-boats, Churchill's escorts. Everything else was guesswork. And so, the first mystery of this series is not a single vessel, but a place, a dead zone of Allied situational awareness, a theatre where ships ended mid-sentence. It's the foundation layer of every individual case that follows. A real strategic environment where a hull could go down, 100 souls could vanish, and the only surviving trace might be one line in one convoy signal log. Entered at 0214, North Atlantic, heavy sea state, nothing more. Because if the ocean had the power to wipe the slate this clean, then the question becomes far more urgent when we begin naming the ships that never came home. How do we assign blame when the sea never tells you what it swallowed? Next, we go to the first ship on our list. The SS Gale Force is the kind of case the Admiralty never liked being asked about. Because every time the file is reopened, basic assumptions about how wartime ships die start to wobble. The Collier was not a glamorous vessel. She was not a destroyer, not a cruiser, not a ship of the line that makes museum wall posters. She was a workhorse, built for coal, not headlines. And yet, her disappearance on 2nd March 1941 remains one of the rare losses the Royal Navy had to file under cause unknown, despite operating under convoy escort, in a region where at least 2 sets of destroyer hydrophones should have heard something, anything, if she had been torpedoed. Instead, a ship, 43 crew, last known alive at 55-46N, 18-12W, west of Rockall, and then nothing. Convoy HG and HX routes passing through this area in winter 1941 were hell. Waves could top 15 meters even outside of storms. The armed merchant cruisers, the big liners with boiler rooms turned into gun rooms, recorded seas so high that crews wrote home that the ocean felt like stone. But even in storm seas, U-boats left signs. A torpedo does not politely slip into a hull and leave no trace. The magnetic pistols used in 1941 were imperfect, yes, but they were loud. Escorts could often tell a dud from a hit simply by acoustic signature. Even surface detonation late in war, the TIII pattern, left at least a partial boom. Yet HMS Wolverine and HMS Verity, the 2 sloop escorts closest to gale force that night, logged no detonations at all. In their night order books, both preserved, the engineers wrote routine speed and bearing entries. No depth charge patterns, no emergency turns, nothing. We know the convoy's dust position. We know the weather. We know the sea was high but not lethal at the hour she vanished. We know her radio officer tapped out a message describing a wolfpack's probable shadowing. That log ended at exactly 2018 hours. The next transmission time, 2030, never came. The wireless silence triggered no immediate action, because silence was normal during convoy darkened ship hours. It was only at dawn, when the column was reformed and counted, that the gap appeared in the starboard column. The wake where gale force should have been was open water. ADM 199-2141, the official timed loss file, is painfully short. 12 pages, 1 photograph, 2 appended plotting sheets. The conclusion, probable enemy action. But the escort logs contradict it, which raises the other possibility, one the Admiralty rarely inserted into wartime public release statements. Catastrophic engineering failure at night in heavy sea, followed by a near-instant downflooding that killed electrical power before distress call. A type of death made possible by the frailty of coal carriers, many of which had hatches reinforced for peace, not war, except even that doesn't match the search results, because after dawn, and for 48 continuous hours, the convoy rear screens did something very unusual. They doubled back. They ran box search patterns around the last plotted place they expected the collier to be. The sea state was harsh, yes, but in 60 hours not a single piece of driftwood, coal sack, paper, nothing floated into sight. That is statistically strange. In wartime, debris floated. Tar paper, crate lids, rope, hutches, buckets, leaflets from convoy postal sacks. But the lookouts saw clean horizon. One coxswain later said the silence on the bridge was like a morgue. In the late 1990s, a marine archaeology group out of Bergen attempted to detect anomalies on this seabed using deep twin-frequency side scan, not because they were hunting gale force specifically, but because the site overlapped a survey license for a telecom cable. They mapped the seafloor down to 3,000 meters. They found ridges, drop-offs, slopes capable of tumbling a hull into crevices like a ball bearing falling under a warehouse pallet. Could a ship, violently hit by a single well-placed torpedo, actually break apart and slide fast enough to be effectively invisible to surface search? Perhaps, but that presumes a torpedo. And again, the escorts that night heard none. Some researchers argue this is one of the best candidates for an unobserved break and sink from structural stress at convoy speed. Others think an unlogged mine, laid by a German raider in a prior season, could have done it. And there is a darker theory in a US Naval War College monograph from 1981 that the ship simply slid under a wave strike that broke her back. But in truth, this case sits where it always sat, halfway between chart and rumour. The ocean, as always, provides no affidavit. A working ship with no romance attached to her name, gone in 12 minutes of unwitnessed time, and so we move on to a vessel that carried US steel into the Arctic Circle itself, and died without a scrap of wreckage drifting into Soviet hands. Next, convoy JW-55A had a very specific purpose when it sailed out of Loch Ewe in December 1943. Keep the Transantarctic lifeline open, no matter how violent the weather or how thin the escort screen became in those endless polar latitudes. The US Liberty ship, Daniel Huger, was one of the 19 merchant vessels in that convoy. Built in Charleston, standardized to the classic EC2 SC1 Liberty profile, with a triple expansion engine and that unmistakable bluff bow. If you look at the official sailing roster, you'll see her name appears entirely ordinary. Another hull, another Liberty, another steel box carrying cargo from American industry into the Soviet war furnace. But the way she disappeared is not ordinary. She left no flotsam, she left no bodies, and she left no post-loss accounting. In a sea where even shredded cargo nets usually survive long enough to be found. W-55A is better known in naval history because 2 weeks later, its twin convoy, JW-55B, would draw the attention of the Kriegsmarine, and the German battleship Scharnhorst would die under a British 14-inch gunnery storm. But this is precisely why the Daniel Huger's loss is so maddening. We know the period, the weather windows, the escort dispositions, the route, and the enemy threat pattern. We have Admiralty Convoy Escort Report E55A3 filed in January 1944, and it documents Wolfpack attempts, suspected mine layers near Nordkapp, Luftwaffe torpedo bomber grids from Trondheim, even the sonar anomalies off Bear Island. And in that mountain of operational paperwork, we still have a hole where one steel ship simply evaporates. The Arctic Sea has a unique cruelty. The waves do not behave like the Atlantic rollers off Rockall. They can feel square, like the tops are sheared off by the wind. Spray freezes instantly, and a ship can lose displacement margins simply from ice mass. Lookouts on JW-55 convoys wore cloth over respirators to avoid cold burns on their cheeks. The sailors' diaries talk about binoculars freezing to gloves. But again, cold does not erase all evidence. Cold doesn't destroy crates. Cold doesn't vaporize cargo. The ocean, even that far north, still behaves like a conveyor of debris. The Daniel Huger radioed something very specific at 1841 one night after passing 71 degrees north. And this is where the file gets uncomfortable. The wireless officer did not mention U-boats. He mentioned danger from mines. Suspected magnetic, probably German-laid. The Germans had indeed used mine layers in the Barents beginning in 1942. U-703s, the auxiliary mine layers, Brummer and Skagerrak. But these were charted zones, or at least partially inferred by Allied intel. Any magnetic mine strike would have resulted in a dull, heavy underwater bang. Escorts would have heard it through the hull. They didn't. At Murmansk, Soviet rescue trawlers were already accustomed to combing the ice margins for debris from Arctic sinkings. They had practiced this in 1942 and 1943 with terrifying regularity. The port logs from Polyarny show an almost obsessive Soviet compulsion to salvage rope, canvas, even loose plank wood, because wartime supply was so tight that trash became resource. Yet not a single crate of the Daniel Huger's cargo was ever logged as recovered, not even in the unclassified Soviet post-war returns. The wind on that night would have driven anything buoyant toward Kola Bay. But the sea was empty. One theory argued by US naval war, college researchers in the 1970s, is that the hull may not have broken. It may have inverted and sunk as a single intact tube, bow down under deep water column pressure, like a weighted pipe. Some Liberty hulls, especially those welded in early 42 and 43 runs, had brittle fracture issues. The infamous low-temperature steel grain boundary failure. The ship could, in theory, break internally, flood violently, lose electricity, and go under before a wireless distress was sent. But that scenario still leaves the question of floating junk. Something should have surfaced. Modern oceanographic charts show the fjord lip and the Kola Basin have steep shelves, and anything that drops beyond a certain slope might freefall into abyssal plains that remain poorly mapped even today. In 1998 and 2002, joint Norwegian-Russian surveys using twin-frequency sidescan tried to map those plains to locate Cold War dumping sites, and they documented dozens of incomplete contacts, nothing that could be conclusively tied to a Liberty hull. The uncomfortable truth is that Daniel Huger is the type of case that denies historians closure. The loss cannot be neatly assigned to a U-boat kill to Luftwaffe torpedo bombers, to mines, or to brittle fracture, because none of those explanations fit the absence of debris. It leaves us, even now in 2025, using her as a data point in discussions about clean vanishings. And now we go to a corvette, smaller, manned by Free French and Royal Naval reserve crews whose disappearance has baffled post-war seabed surveys even more. In April 1943, the corvette Roselis, a Flower-class hull serving under Free French command, but crewed partly by Royal Naval Reserve ratings, detached from the northbound B-7 convoy group in waters west of the Hebrides. She was not on a glamorous mission. She was not chasing a surfaced U-boat in a gunnery finale like the later Bay of Biscay slugging matches. Her task was prosaic, procedural, and usually unrewarded. Pursue a faint HF-DF bearing, a directional radio trace, that the convoy's signals office believed might be a Kriegsmarine boat transmitting coded traffic to BDU. In that era, convoy escorts would aggressively poke toward the edges of their columns to break up German wolf-pack geometry. In this case, the Roselys plotted a bearing line that in theory should have placed a U-boat contact 5 to 9 nautical miles southwest of her. She transmitted no emergency call after the detachment. She never returned. Flower-class corvettes were originally conceived for coastal escort, yet by 1943, many were performing blue water duty in seas they were never truly optimized for. They were short, snub-bowed, high-metacentric ships, which meant they rolled hard. One Canadian skipper famously joked that a flower rolled on wet grass. Their ASDIC could be effective in calm weather, but in Beaufort's 7 seas, the return pulse became cluttered with false shower. Even so, escorts normally reported something if weapon contact occurred. A depth charge run triggered in 2 stages, a gunnery order, then the timed underwater explosions, which other ships in acoustic range often heard. But Convoy B7's night logs do not list a single timed bang consistent with Roselys' firing charges. There is also no recorded enemy claim. No Kriegsmarine or diary entry, no KTB from a boat in that grid, has ever matched her presumed loss window. The Free French Naval Museum's typed roster of 1943 escort dispositions shows Roselys had recently undergone minor refit at Devonport, including pump checks and hull condition inspection. Nothing in that yard period suggested catastrophic hull weakness. She was, if anything, mechanically routine. Yet when she vanished that night, she did so completely that even the escorts regrouping at dawn could not find paint scrapings, deck timber, a Carly float, nothing. The Royal Navy's Western Approaches Command sent repeated post-event queries to the surviving B-7 escorts. None had heard a thing. The only common thread in testimony was a sense of baffling abruptness. One ship was on the board at 200, and gone by 0300. Theories proliferate, but none are satisfying. One camp suggests spontaneous internal explosion, boiler failure, ammunition detonation, or oil vapor ignition. It has happened. The corvette HMS Bluebell blew up almost instantaneously off Kola in 1945 when struck by a Gnat acoustic torpedo. But Bluebell left debris. Survivors were pulled from the water. The shockwave was logged in multiple ships' deck logs. The Roselys event has none of this. Others propose she rammed an uncharted pinnacle or seamount. The Hebridean margin does hide dangerous bathymetry. But once again, even a hull break on a high-speed impact would have left flotsam. There is also the paperwork anomaly. A minor one, but persistent. The convoy plotted her detachment bearing using an HF-DF set that was known to produce spurious echoes if the German operator was transmitting on a low-angle lobe and surface ducting was present. A false bearing could have sent Roselys into sea she never needed to be in. If she overcorrected helm in heavy swell, broached, struck a beam sea, and down-flooded through the forward well deck, she could have nose-dived bows in, the Flower's weakest axis. But even if that tragic geometry is accepted, it still leaves the absence of surface sign. The modern seabed work is the most chilling element. Since 2005, commercial survey ships have side-scanned more than 90 square nautical miles of the probable loss area. They've identified trawlers, merchantmen, and unclassified debris. But none of the faint wreck signatures match a Flower-class hull length of 205 feet with her distinct twin deckhouse proportions. In 2019, a private sonar contractor published a deep scatter plot showing 2 elongated anomalies. But metallurgy from nearby debris did not match the 1940 Yarrow-grade flour steel. So the Roseleys remains, in the most depressingly literal truth, unlocated. This is why the case is feared by naval archivists, because the implication is not supernatural, it is procedural. It suggests that under certain combinations of darkness, swell, helm angle, and luckless geometry, a warship could die unobserved in minutes, and the ocean would not even bother to leave wreckage as evidence. And if a corvette could vanish on the margins of the British Isles, then what about a destroyer in the harder, dirtier, more chaotic Mediterranean, where record-keeping itself frayed under siege pressure? Next, the case of HMS Gallant is, in many ways, more bureaucratically infuriating than operationally dramatic, because it reveals how a ship can die twice, once by explosive damage and again by clerical corrosion. Built by Alexander Stephen and Sons in 1935, a G-class destroyer with that lean interwar British profile, 3 funnels in as-built form, later too, she had already been marked by violence by the time she limped into Malta in January 1941. On the 10th of that month, while escorting convoy MG1, Gallant struck an Italian-laid mine off the island's approaches. The explosion blew off part of her bow. Photographs taken from the island show her forward hull as a jagged, open wound. Even then, even ruined, she survived. She was towed into Grand Harbour, berthed, jury-rigged, and assessed for repair. The siege context is essential. Malta in 1941 was the most bombed place in the world, per capita. You could track Luftwaffe weight of effort by the chalkboards in Valletta, where civil defence scribbled raid tallies. The island was a staging ground for Force K, British strike units that slashed at Axis convoys to North Africa. Repair yards were overloaded. Damaged hulls were triaged like battlefield casualties. And so Gallant, wounded but theoretically repairable, sat for months while the guns of Axis airfields in Sicily tried to starve the island and sink anything in harbour. By 1943, the Admiralty concluded she was not worth the wartime steel it would cost to rebuild her permanently. Scuttling plans were drawn up, and this is where the mystery begins, because the scuttling coordinates were never cleanly preserved. Some Admiralty copies suggest a deliberate tow and sink off the Ras el Hobj bank. Others refer to a disposal toward the deeper Montagne shelf. ADM 199-394 is inconsistent with Force K's signals book. There are at least 3 grid square references, one of which is impossible given the tide window limitations of the dockyards at the time. After war, the oceanographic and diver community around Malta tried to match steel fragments found in trawls and nets to known sinkings, and 3 separate expeditions thought they had found her. In each case, the sample metallurgy did not match. The Yarrow plate used on Gallant in 1935 has an identifiable signature in microstructure, lower sulfur content, different decarburization profile, and the shards found in nets in the 1970s and early 1980s were higher phosphorus late-war scrap, likely post-1944 dump. The important thing here is not the romance of the case, but the absurdities it reveals. This is not the broad, uncharted Arctic. This is not the Black Pit west of Rockall. This is Malta, the most surveyed patch of war water in the central Mediterranean. Divers have catalogued nearly every shoal, every shelf, every drop-off, and with all that, we still cannot conclusively place a destroyer that was once tied up, photographable, measurable, and wounded in a harbour visible from Valletta's limestone bastions. If a ship can become a phantom here, then the line between known wreck and missing wreck is thinner than historians like to admit. There is also a cultural sting. Some naval historians argue that British file fragmentation, the thousands of micro-memos, the wartime retyping of coordinates, the mid-war code changes, created data fractures that still infect the archival record today. In quiet rooms in Kew, you can hold 2 sheets of paper from the same file that list 2 different approximate sink sites. Multiply that across thousands of losses, and you get a historical map that is not a map at all, but a palimpsest of approximations. So what does HMS Gallant represent in this list? She is the proof that even an ostensibly known sinking can, in the hot friction of war, slide into the unknown. And she is also the bridge into the final entry of these 5. Because the last case is not about the event of sinking itself, but about what happens when the data chain is broken beyond repair. A reminder that steel can vanish not only underwater, but inside paperwork. And so we come to the last problem. After hundreds of escorts logged sonar, recorded detonations, and signaled admiralty with precise bearings. There are still hulls that sit beneath thousands of meters of salt water, never yet scanned by sonar, never yet correlated by plate sample, never yet assigned a chart symbol. The ones that remain not only lost, but undiscovered. Next, this final category, the fifth in our tallying, is not a single ship with a single log entry, but a class of unfound wartime vanishings that still sit beneath the water column, in places where even today, in the era of multi-beam bathymetry, the ocean remains a lid. The cleanest cases share two things: a narrow window of last contact, and absolutely nothing after. This is important. A warship that sends even a single partial distress, a clipped rrrr, or a broken set of call letters, leaves seams in the evidence chain. You can reconstruct course, derive probable bearing of threat, chart and intercept geometry. But the wartime silence cases are different. They are like holes punched through the data tape. Take the unnamed destroyer reported lost west of Cape Farewell, Greenland. In 1944, a loss that US Naval Historical Records Branch once attempted to attach to U-boat kill claims, and then later abandoned, because no known U-boat in that square claimed any destroyer in that time window. In one Admiralty table, the destroyer's presumed loss is printed as a one-line entry between fuel consumption tallies. One escort failed to report dawn position. That is all. Just that. As if a warship is a rounding error. Or the cargo carrier logged only in War Loss Ledger 1443 as probable U-boat kill. No trace. Those ledger books were meant to be stopgaps. Rough, fast, wartime accounting. They were supposed to be replaced by the post-war official loss tables, but the post-war tables were based on the wartime ledgers. It is a closed loop of uncorroborated assumptions. And somewhere inside that circular paperwork recursion are hulls that have never been found. Modern oceanography has narrowed some of these voids. The Faroes Shelf, the Greenlandic margin, conjugate flanks of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Most of these areas have scatter-level data, but scatter is not identity. Scatter is the oceanographic equivalent of hearing a dull hum through a wall. You know something is there, but you don't know what it is. And so even with 21st century tools, we cannot close the books. It is tempting, in a narrative like this, to infer something paranormal, to add ghost story to the ledger. But the real mystery is more brutal and more prosaic. WWII was a logistical furnace, and the ocean is large. That combination alone explains far more vanishings than any invented phenomenon. A ship that suffers sudden internal failure at night in poor seas will down flood within minutes. If heavy stores break free in the hold, the ship can go stern down instantly. If the sea takes the hatch gratings as she goes under, nothing light enough to float may survive. If she sinks bow down through a thermocline, the ASDIC return trace can evaporate in a single sweep. That is not science fiction. That is 1940s naval architecture meeting dynamic oceanography. And the final twist is paperwork. In 1944, escort groups were rotating at a tempo that churned record-keeping. A destroyer lost on one watchbill might be recorded by a different duty officer with a different notation standard in a different corner of a different war diary. Multiply those inconsistencies across the entire Battle of the Atlantic, and you get precisely what the Royal Navy Anti-Submarine Warfare Division feared in 1941, that a handful of vanishings would slip outside the grid of cause and effect, which means there are still hulls, steel, riveted or welded, full length, intact or broken, lying beneath salt water in places where nobody has yet dragged a hydrophone. They are not myth, they are not spectral, they are merely uncharted, and so we close this 5-case look at ships that are not merely sunk, but missing. In absolute terms, they are small against the war's toll, but conceptually, they are enormous. They remind us that the ocean is not a ledger and the war was not a database. Even the most meticulously plotted convoy sheets can end in blank water, which sets us up for the next stage in this narrative, translating these historical silences into visual language, turning the gaps in the record into the emotional frame of a documentary. Because the sea may hide its wrecks, but our story now needs to show their absence.